Well, Happy New Year. It's a little late for that, although I think it's never too late. So happy New Year to all of you. Well, hopefully it is going to be another good year, although, well, at least financially and business-wise. Today you'll hear Adam talking about last year. As you heard, the first couple of quarters were actually pretty strong. So let's hear how the fourth quarter has been. I'll first hand it over to Frank Vitagliano. So Frank, over to you.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everybody, and thanks for joining, and certainly Happy New Year. These meetings that we've been having, these sessions, probably now for, well, we started them at the beginning of last year. We've been doing them pretty consistently. Have proven to be, and the input that we get are really valuable to a lot of you, and certainly the data and what's happening in the marketplace and the understanding of that, I think, is beneficial. So from a GTDC standpoint, one of the things that we continue to do, and I know many of you are aware of this, is develop content and some information as to what's happening in the marketplace. And we have two reports that we recently released. The first one is called Looking Beyond the Curve. And essentially, it's a compilation of a lot of the work that we did coming out of our event, our forum that we held in the fourth quarter, and sort of a recap of what's happening in the marketplace, where the investments are, and the perspective of many of senior executives in the distribution space, many of whom were on this call. And what I found over time is that when we do these events, we sometimes don't spend enough time following up and making sure that we either publish or re-emphasize some of the key points. So Looking Beyond the Curve is intended to do that. The second one that we've done is one that I think is near and dear to a lot of us here, is what's going on in the hyperscaler space. What are the potential implications? Why does it matter? And how is distribution faring, in this space, whether it's with, each of the distributors' own, sites, marketplaces, or working in conjunction with, the big hyperscalers, and what's happening in the space and what do we see going forward. And so that report's recently been finished, and that's available both on gtdc.org. And I'd encourage you to take a look at it, and as always, tell us what you think. So we've got that going on. The other thing that I wanted to spend 1 second up front talking about is that when we had our board meeting, the GTDC board meeting in the December timeframe, so a lot of the discussion was around, as we talked about what should we focus on next year, what are some of the things we should look into. There was a lot of input and discussion around the idea of sustainability and what's happening in the marketplace regarding sustainability. What are the, again, why does that matter? What are the vendors doing? What are the distributors doing? How can we figure out a way maybe to have some dialogue and jointly talk about what we're doing in the marketplace? So we plan to, at GTDC, we plan to dig into that topic in 2022. Frankly, a lot of it was coming from Europe. A lot of the discussion was led by some of the European senior executives like Alessandro, and I know Tim's on the call, and Tim and I have had a long discussion about it. So we do plan to, this year, you'll see some activity from us in this space. But sort of to just maybe reinforce what we think is happening, we've got a question that I think we'll start with on the Slido, and maybe you could put it up. Yep. So kind of how would you evaluate what your organization is doing in the ESG space, environmental, social, and governance programs? We look at it from economic, environmental, and social, same kind of approach. So interested in the answer to the question, and then we'll turn it over to Adam, and we'll talk about this for a minute, just talk about the responses, and then we'll move on to the normal data review, because I think we're all interested in seeing what happened, how did we finish out, 2021 collectively, and some of the detail behind it. So Adam, let me turn it over to you.
So we've got 14 responses, and it looks like it's very clearly in the still maturing, awareness growing. 13% well established, and then 13% no formal program established. Yeah? Does that sort of fit in with what you would be expecting, Frank?
Yeah, I think so, because to do this properly, this isn't a set of slides. This is a significant, investment that companies have to decide to make, and it's not trivial. So I think it's one that's going to continue to evolve, over the next, number of years, and we're certainly seeing it on the vendor side. So I'm not surprised at all with that, and I think maybe some of the work that we can do going forward can maybe help with that also.
Okay, great. Thanks. So I'll move on to the data. So let me just move on. There we are. So here we are, the mountain scene. And I think that we can say that Q4 was achieved. A huge effort was made by distribution. It looked very dodgy the last time I came and spoke to you in November. We had a very poor November, which was very much impacted by supply chain more than anything else. And then we had a huge December, the biggest month on record, which actually recovered the situation. And although it wasn't quite at the level of Q4, it was still an amazing performance. And I'll take you through the detail of that. So what you can see is that we forecast a negative growth of -1.5%. That was the central estimate for Q4. We said it would be ±2%, so -3.5%. When November came through, I really thought that it was going to be hard for us to achieve that. So I gave ourselves a bit of a wider berth and said that it could be quite a bit worse than that. If December had carried on the way that November was, it would have been a really poor quarter. There were some voices, by the way, who were very constant saying that the results would hold. So the positive people won out in the end. And in the end, the negative growth was just within the context range that we put down. It came in at -3.4% in Q4, which is nevertheless a very strong performance against 2019, which I'll show you in a minute. So let's then move on and see how that was in the countries. This is the forecast that we put out by country. So we were saying in Q4 it'd be -5 in Germany, -1 in the UK, -5 in Italy, etc. You can see that. And this is how things actually panned out. So it was -10 in Germany, and that was the one that really didn't pull through. The others came in pretty close to the forecast. Italy had an extraordinary month of 11% growth in December, which meant that the whole quarter was very, very strong in Italy. And overall, most of the countries came in pretty close to the forecast. Now, in that German number, we'd already taken into account the telecom shift, which we knew was, in fact, taking away quite a bit of revenues in the German market because of the decision by one of the vendors to go direct. Telecoms in Germany in Q4 was -55% compared to the prior year. So we'd already factored that into the -5%. So that additional performance was very much down to supply chain. That was the uncertainty of the year end with the governmental change and basically a lack of demand. So if you look at it, Germany didn't end the year so well, and we're going to see that overall when we look at the full year. This is what the year looks like when you take the kind of helicopter view of it. a huge first half of the year, like Frank said. Q1 and Q2 were amazing. Then you get into these two latter quarters where you've really got two factors. One is, of course, that the comparatives are really tough because they were very big growth quarters in the prior year. But also you had this supply chain issue, which really impacted the business. So we do a sanity check every time, and this is what the sanity check says. And the important thing about the sanity check is Q3 and Q4. What that shows in Q3 and Q4 is that even if the level of growth was down, in fact, if you look at it against 2019, we're still talking about 7.6% growth in Q3 and 7.1% growth in Q4. So lower than those extraordinary months, still very much influenced by the pandemic, but still a very, very significant level of growth. So it is a really positive end to the quarter. And what that means is that we're looking at a year with 3.6% growth overall year on year compared to 7.2% last year, and 11.3% when we do our sanity check, which is a huge, huge growth. Obviously, this is over 2 years because it's from 2019, but nevertheless, a huge, huge growth. Now let's have a look at it by country. And what you can see is that it's really Central Europe and the Nordics which have driven the growth in 2021. So if you look on the left-hand side, we've ranked it in order of percentage growth. The dark blue is in fact 2021, and the light blue is the 2020 results against prior year. And what you can see there is that countries like Denmark, Poland continued really strong, Sweden, Czech Republic, and then you get to the big countries, Italy, Spain, UK. So those were the three really strong ones of the large countries. You look at a country like Spain growing 5% on 13% last year. So a huge additional growth on the previous year. The two countries that didn't do so well were France. It did go into positive territory of 1%. And having gone down last year, it was one of the few countries that went down in 2020. And Germany actually was negative. Now, if you take out the impact of telecoms, because that includes the impact of the telecom shift, in fact, it grew by 2% Germany, so it's not quite as negative as it looks there. I'd like to just mention the other countries. We've got Anton here. I'm sure we've got people from the other countries that we cover in our panels. The last time I presented these numbers was in May, and that was kind of at the peak because we hadn't had the June month end where there was a bit of a decline. And so things were looking pretty positive when I presented the numbers back in May. So we were looking at 18% for Russia, 10 for South Africa, and 28 for the Baltics. In fact, the year end was a little bit less growth than that. Still very good in Russia, 5%, just above 2% for South Africa, and the Baltics growing very strongly. When you look at it on a quarter by quarter basis, you see that, in fact, South Africa has an interesting profile. Anton might explain a little bit of what happened there. Q2 and Q3 went down quite a bit, and then there was a huge Q4, and so it was a very strong close to the year end in South Africa. But again, when we relativize these things and we look at the Q4 performance, what we see is that, in fact, although it was 14% growth on 2020, in fact, it's less, 11% less than 2019. So there's still some catch up going on in South Africa to get back to the 2019 performance. So let's have a look now at the volume value split. So the volume value split tells its own story. It tells the story of how the volume, as soon as we get into those really tough comparatives of Q3 and Q4, went negative. And the value business really started to increase, of course, in Q2 2020, It was a very, very poor value quarter. That was the height of the pandemic. But nevertheless, what we're seeing there is quite significant growth in the value business as we get towards the year end. And we see it's positive overall in the year. And here, when we look at it in Q4, I've only looked at Q4. But here in Q4, what you can see is that in most countries, the story about volume is decrease against 2020, but increase against 2019. Take the outstanding example of Poland. It grew 53% against 2019. And it grew, in fact, only 2% in Q4 2021. So in fact, that is building on a huge growth from the first year against 2019. There are two exceptions, which are in fact Germany and France, neither of which have got their volume business in Q4 back to where they were before. So we've already explained what happened in Germany, and in France, a similar type of feedback. I think in France, it was very much demand driven. More than supply chain. We heard a lot from distributors that Q4, even now, it's not such a strong market at the moment with demand for IT products through the channel. When we look at the value business, we see that in most countries, in fact, it's growth against 2020 and against 2019. There is one exception. And the one major exception there is France, and France is still not back up to its 2019 performance. And France is very much a value market, so that's important for France to get back to there. They didn't have quite the same growth in software that other countries had. So let's move on now to where does that leave the different countries? Okay, so this is like the balance sheet of the year. Let's have a look and see where the relative weight is of them. And you can see that Germany is still the largest distribution country in Europe by quite a long way. It lost some share in 2021. In fact, if you take out the impact of telecoms, it's only come down by 0.7%. Here you can see it's actually come down overall by 1.3%. And the big gainers are UK, Italy. You can see that Sweden had a really, really strong year, particularly in the second half of the year, and some amazing results in software sales in Sweden. And you can see some of the smaller countries as well, which have done pretty well. So that gives you that sort of relative positioning. If we look at the channels, then what we see is that we could call 2021 the year of the small and medium reseller. So they grew by 7.4% overall in Europe, and in most countries they did really well. They came back after being furloughed during 2020. But most importantly, they really have been grabbing opportunities, and the feedback we've had is that the sector is really alive and positive. The corporate reseller sector, which only grew 1% below the overall market for the year, 3.7 or 3.6% for the year, therefore losing a little bit of its share of the market. The corporate reseller has actually been most impacted by the lack of projects taking off. And it really only started to happen in the second half of the year. We've seen things like toner sales down, we've seen the infrastructure sales down. And of course, when you look at the numbers, it's absolutely amazing to see the huge increase that happened in the corporate reseller channel in the last few weeks of 2021. They did really, really well, and obviously captured quite a bit of business at the end of the year. Retail, after a very, very strong year, the prior year lost a little bit of share, and e-tailer consumer continued to grow in 2021. So that gives us a channels view. And now just to take you through the highs and the lows, the mountains and the valleys. You'll be used to this presentation now. This is just a reminder of what it was in 2020 when we looked at the growth against 2019. This unbelievable growth in mobile computing, the loss in desktop, infrastructure, negative, a big highlight in monitors. And of course, in 2020, there was a huge growth in computing components, accessories, headsets. So those were the big stories of 2020. Now let's have a look at the same story for 2021. You can see that basically things have flattened out a bit. The only really nice mountain peaks are LFD and monitors, which have grown really, really strongly. Other displays, that was driven by a big Q4 of televisions, computing components, graphic cards, computing accessories, headsets, AV systems against a huge 2020, which is of course that's the headsets there, that's right. Computing accessories is webcams mainly. But let's have a look at the left-hand side, which is kind of where all the money is. The left-hand side is mobile computing, still grew 7% compared to the prior year, which is pretty extraordinary after 29% the year before. Desktops never quite recovered and still not in growth mode. Infrastructure and security, a bit of a turnaround there. That's the value business. Software and licenses is literally one of the strongest performing and growing areas of the channel, and it's the one to watch. We saw really, really strong close to the year. We know that cloud is growing very significantly through distribution at between 20+ and 40+% per year from the tracking that we do of it. So those are some really like highlights of 2021 when you look at the mountains and the valleys. Let's have a look at it just to finish off with a vendor perspective. So I've taken the top 20 volume vendors and the top 20 value vendors as well. And what you can see in terms of the volume vendors is an overall growth of 4% of these 20 vendors against 2.5% in the total volume market in the year. So what does that mean? It really means that the top 20 vendors have taken most of the large proportion of the growth in the volume market in 2021. If you look at Apple, a simple percentage hides a multiplicity of truths. They were up 24.5% on notebooks, down 11.7% on smartphones, and plus 13% on tablets. And the smartphones is entirely to do with their decision to divert some of their supply to a direct supply to retailers. HP plus 3.5% on notebooks, minus 13% on desktops and monitors. Lenovo flat on notebooks, and 60% up on workstations, 38% up on monitors. And Dell plus 11% on notebooks, the big winner of the notebooks in 2021, plus 30 on monitors, plus 11% on desktops. Dell had an extraordinarily good year. If you look at some of the others, Logitech continued its very strong performance, considering what last year was. It's done exceptionally well. MSI, the gaming aspect, Brother, one of the good printers. AMD lost a bit of share this year. It gained a lot last year, lost a bit this year. And then you've got Jabra headsets, etc. So that's the volume. Now let's look at the value. Okay, let's look at the value. So in the top value vendors, they grew by 2% against 5.4% in the value market. Again, what is that saying? It's actually saying the smaller vendors did better in terms of growth than the large vendors. And when you look at the large vendors, you can see that they've struggled. Again, a simple percentage hides lots of realities. So for HPE, network switches were up 5%. They were down in servers. Cisco was up in wireless networking and flat in switches. Dell had a really good year in servers, and also VMware did really well as well. But we pointed this out in the past, is some of these smaller vendors which have had some really great percentage growth rates through the channel. You can see that, because I've put the actual volumes, you can see the first 5 are the really big ones in terms of what goes through the channel, but the other ones, which are smaller, actually have got some really high percentages there. And if you look through the entire vendors that sell through distribution, you would see quite a few high percentage growths in order to make to that 5.4% value growth. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I don't know if anyone has any questions at this stage. What I've done is on the Slido, there's a Q&A so that people can ask questions if they want to. But I'm going to turn the focus now a little bit onto 2022. And in the past, in these sessions, which is really tremendous, is we've had great discussions from people here about how they see things going. I know that Anton has volunteered to give his commentary. I hope others will volunteer as well who are on the call. But what I'm going to do is ask a few questions about 2022 and then see what you think, and then we can sort of open it up in the last few minutes to any questions that people have. So let me just put up the first one. So the first question is, of course, the one that which we're working on at the moment, is trying to work out what we think, based on our numbers, the likely growth of the whole distribution market is in 2022. So I remind you, 7.2% in 2020, 3.6% in 2021. Where do people think the distribution is going to be in 2022? Now, Slido is vicious because what happens is when one of the choices becomes the main choice, the order flips. So you have to watch very carefully to see. But okay, it looks like we are kind of at the 3 to 4%. So I'm going to ask Anton. Anton, what do you think?
Thanks. Okay. I think from our perspective, if I had to just give you context for South Africa quickly, as we entered the first quarter of 2020, the economy was already playing a big role in our business, and it was already in decline early in 2020. We then had a full lockdown in Q2, which shifted the whole cadence of our quarters. And a big recovery then in Q3 from the lockdown in Q2. And then in Q4, we started, in Q3 and Q4, we started really feeling the pinch on supply, and because the strong growth that was in Europe. And so, and through Q1, Q2, and Q3, we had really slow supply, and we struggled with supply in just about every aspect. First, mobile compute, then we had the print following, and then ultimately we had the whole enterprise compute space also going into shortages and supply constraints. On top of that, in Q2 last year and Q3 last year, we had those riots, and that had a very deep impact on our economy. And so what you're seeing today now is the base effects. There was a base effect. We had a big Q3 in 2020, the riots in Q3 in 2021, and that plays out negatively. Now, what we were watching like a hawk all the time was to see what is happening in Europe, because we knew when Europe started to stutter, we would get all the supply. And that's exactly what happened in Q4. All of a sudden, especially in the consumer mobile space, the mobile compute space, we got floods of stock coming our way, and it plays almost directly. So all your negative, your slight tapering off in growth resulted in supply to South Africa. And we're now sitting, we have a classical bullwhip effect. So we were very short of stock. Now we've got lots of stock, and now we'll probably, over the next 2 quarters, get to the right level of stock. I see that we would grow this year purely because we have got supply coming at us. And while the economy will meet the real economy somewhere in the next quarter or two, I do think that we will still have growth on last year, purely because of base effects and a better matching between supply and demand. I do think there's still demand in the marketplace, but that will taper off towards Q3 and Q4. The cloud space in South Africa is growing at pace. It's much faster than, it's about 40 to 50%. In the infrastructure as a service space, from a hyperscaler perspective, we're looking at about 85% growth.
Wow.
So obviously off a lower base, but I think there's massive growth there. So, and if you add that into our place, then we probably see growth in excess of 5% overall in our market. And yeah, I think that's just a sort of a summary of what's happening.
Thanks, Anton. That's really great. So it's very encouraging to hear that, and also to think that 59% of people are seeing this 3 to 4% growth, which, you know, building on 2 very strong years. I think that's really encouraging. I'm going to give other people a chance to say something when we get on to the next questions. I just want to make sure that we do that. So here's one to get your crystal balls out on. Which industry sector will grow the most in 2022? These are not randomly chosen, these 5. They're all really important sectors in our data. You know, you take some of them, they may not have been growing so much in the last couple of years, but maybe they will grow. Some of them have been growing hugely in the last, you know, couple of years, and maybe they've still got a lot more growth potential in them. So far, the networking is definitely the one which is winning out. So I'm going to ask if there's somebody who voted for networking who would like to say why they think that networking has got the strongest potential in 2022. So there's at least 6 or 7 people who could have voted for that. If anyone feels shy, I will move on to another category. I'll move on to software. Software. Software has just taken an equal place. So maybe someone who has voted for software will say why they think software will be the biggest growth area.
Hey, Adam, this is Frank. I don't know if my vote counts because I'm not on the front lines like a lot of the senior executives on this call, and certainly the vendors, but I voted for networking. And the reason I did is my sense is there's pent up demand that we will see getting fulfilled as we roll through 2022. I know that, you know, there was a bit of a rebound in the fourth quarter as you went through, but a lot of the discussions I've been having and a lot of the input that we've gotten from both the vendors and the distributors are that space is one where will continue to grow, and there is some pent up demand. And, you know, the software space is obviously always going to be critical and will obviously continue to grow. But compared to the other items that you had here in the other categories, that was why I voted for it, because that's what I'm hearing is that we should see a continuation of that pent up demand.
Okay, well, that's great. That's really helpful. We had a really interesting discussion about networking, and the question there was, what is more important? Is it more important that people are going back to their offices and finding their networks can no longer cope with the hybrid working where everybody is trying to get onto Zooms from the office and their network wasn't geared up for that? So is that going to be the most important thing? Or is the fact that people are simply not going back to the office going to be a problem, you know, which delays investment in that area? So the feeling at the discussion we had about it yesterday is that the former is going to be the more important, that people are going to get back to the office and realize that their networks just are not up to the levels that is required. Okay, Good. Well, I put warranties and services in there just because I can't, I mean, they are really going down, and that, to me, they're linked very much with the value business. And so let's put it this way, the compares are pretty good. So there's a good chance that the percentage growth in warranties and services could be quite high if there is the, you know, the going back to the projects and the new service revenues coming through. So that was why I put it in there as a possibility and why it'd be interesting to watch. Okay, so which channel do you think will grow the most in 2022? So in 2021, it was SMR. In 2020, percentage growth, it was e-tail consumer. So who's going to grow the most? I have to say e-tail business in our data is a very small part of our database. It represents about 4% of our database. So it's not a huge part, but we're talking percentage growth here. So it doesn't really matter at all. Okay. Okay, well, it looks like people are voting for small and medium-sized resellers continuing their growth in 2022. And I would be interested if anybody would like to comment on that at all.
Adam, if I could comment on the e-tailers.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The reason why I voted e-tail business is because a lot of this is going to be driven by the large vendors driving their programs. And if you look at HP's Amplify program, it's starting to, you know, get some traction on the ground in South Africa, where as distributors, we are almost directed and encouraged to drive e-commerce type capability in partnership with our resellers. So those resellers that are already in that e-commerce space will be there, but a lot of traditional resellers are going to convert, and I see that growth percentage continuing.
Okay, interesting. Well then, okay, so we may well see some more. So what you're saying is more resellers becoming e-tail business.
Yeah, yeah, driven by vendor programs.
Okay, driven by vendor. Okay, interesting. That is interesting. That was a very different way of looking at things, seeing more people going into that sector, redefining almost themselves and their business model. That's interesting, a kind of digital transformation almost. Okay, well, let's go on now. I've got two more questions, which are specific. So what big change is going to most impact business spending over 2022? So we've got here quite a lot of big different types of projects which could change things. So digital transformation is one of the ones. Government infrastructure, there's a huge investment coming through. It's already the most advanced in Italy, I think, but Spain and Poland, if they come to an agreement, Southern Europe, will all be beneficiaries of this next generation EU fund. So that's a good one. And so we've got security, it's scoring well. Education has been a huge driver of 2020 and 2021. If you ask me, there's a sleeping giant at the moment in Europe. It's called Germany. It has a 5 billion digital pact spend on education, which it's only spent about 10% of. And if they got spending that, I can tell you another, adding a bit more, a few billion into our data would show that it was a big growth area. Okay. But I think digital transformation is the obvious winner. And if anyone would like to comment, I don't know if Tim Griffin is still there. Maybe Tim would like to.
So I was somewhat torn between digital transformation and security. I think both are going to continue to drive volume. I think that just every business is realizing that digital transformation is more than a website, and there's an awful lot of work to go and do on that journey. I think if you start thinking about it, one of the challenges is back to this data phenomenon as to where it's stored and where it is, and the cloud comes into play there. And then I think your warranty question becomes a bit of an interesting question, because do you have warranty in the cloud? Well, no. So I think just how that business is going to evolve is kind of interesting, and I call it the washing machine syndrome, really, which is, when we were all young and bought our first washing machine, we all paid for the extended warranty.
Yeah.
And now, of course, we just go and get a new washing machine next business day. They're relatively cheap and they're readily available. And I think that the same applies to IT in many respects, except for the fact that there's data. Well, if your data's in the cloud and you can back up within half an hour, warranties become kind of less of a requirement than perhaps they were 10, 15 years ago. Anyway, digital transformation is where I see people
Great.
being driven to.
Thanks, Tim.
I think security is not wrong either, by the way.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hey, Adam, what strikes me on this question is that now it's understandable why people view 3 and 4% growth, maybe more, but every one of these areas is significant. I mean, if we were putting together a beginning of the year opportunity presentation, the opportunities in each of these areas are significant. And so therefore, and that's six areas that are potentially going to drive really good growth. I think that bodes well and now makes me more confident in the 3 to 4%, because as I look at each one, to me, I could have picked 3 or 4 of those.
Yeah. I think that's a really, really good point, actually. And the other thing as well, there was a kind of negative hidden in there, which was the impact of the wider economy. And so people are not thinking it's going to make a big impact. I mean, we are looking at higher inflation and higher interest rates, fluctuating exchange rates. The IT industry has been incredibly shielded from the wider economy. There are a few clouds on the horizon, in terms of like the health of small businesses. But I mean, it's encouraging. People are not seeing that at the moment as being a big thing. And hybrid working is maybe just because people feel the growth has already happened there. But I still think there's a lot of opportunity there. I mean, in Context, we're renewing our entire IT setup and buying, mobile computing for the whole company in 2022. We've never done that before, so there's a lot of investment going into that in 2022, I think. So it'd be interesting to see. Okay, last one. What big change will impact consumer spending? So this is maybe, I think more people are B2B focused who come to this call, so it may be less relevant, but kind of interesting to see what you think is going to drive consumer IT. It's what gets in the news. Everyone talks about it when there's some new product, smart watches or whatever. Recently, I was reading an article that was saying, again, when's Apple going to launch its VR headset? This is going to be a game changer. It's going to be the new kind of, iPhone of the 2020s when they launched their headset. I had a really interesting feedback from a journalist who talked about the incredible experience she had going on VR. And she's from the Wall Street Journal, so she was really, tough. The only thing she said was that for a woman, it's not very nice. There's a lot of male avatars. There's much fewer female ones, so that you do kind of feel you're in an environment where you have to think about, safeguarding and things like that. But nevertheless, VR, AR is an interesting area. So, okay, so the vote really is for that home IT setup. I mean, that's really interesting, that. And there's still a lot of opportunity for it, I think. So I won't belabor this one because I think we're getting close to our finishing time, but I am going to ask one last question, and that is just a word cloud. And this is, what one factor do you think will most impact the results of the IT channel in 2022? Be interesting. We haven't spoken about supply at all today. That's virtually all I spoke about in November, because we were suffering so much. It's still a huge issue. I think most people are saying, like, when I asked Anton, that we're probably not going to see ourselves coming out of it till the second half of the year. In any case, there we are. Well, that's a very sobering way to end off. I don't know. Anton, do you want to give us a final word?
Yeah, I think 2022 is going to be quite a seminal year for a lot of places. If you look across the globe, I think there's definite. You've got the US-China dynamic. You've got the Russia-Ukraine. Nobody, I think all of those political things is going to have a deep impact. We're not quite out of the. I saw yesterday was the record infection day for us on the pandemic. So there'll be more variants, and I think it will become endemic. But I still think we're going to swing through some supply and demand mismatches. But ultimately, we will hit the real economy, and if China starts on the growth side, all the commodity suppliers is going to stutter with them, So I think there's significant risks from a political and economic on that stage, and I think it's going to have a real impact on our businesses, because we've had false economies in the last 2 years. And it would be interesting to see where the world global growth settles. It seems to be moving around a bit, and I do think that that will have an impact on us. And we're gonna. And the other thing that I think we're gonna have to get to grips with is, because I don't think anybody's got the right answer, is to exactly where we're gonna work. And I think that hasn't been settled either. I see the vaccine mandates are also flexing back and forward. I see Starbucks has just cancelled their vaccine mandate. So I think all of these things are in play, and there's no clear answer. So I think increased uncertainty is what we're going to have to deal with.
Okay, great. Frank, you want to say anything?
No, I agree. I think that when you think about, you mentioned clouds earlier. To me, those are some of the clouds that are out there, right? Some of the things that probably none of us can impact, certainly on a day-to-day basis, but we're at risk of having them impact what we do. So the encouraging part was the slide that you had up with all the different opportunities where we had to pick one, and it was really hard to pick one because there were 5 or 6 that were relative. Now you look at the last slide, and Anton's point is a really good point, because there's some clouds out there that have a lot of people uncomfortable and nervous, and we'll just have to see how they play out. But the underlying business and opportunity is still there, primarily because of the digital, I think, transformation and the changes we're seeing. But it could be a year which we experience some things that we don't want to. So we'll see.
I'd like to hand back to Peter.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Adam, thank you very much again for the overview and the insight. Well, we will have our next call or webinar in about 6 to 8 weeks. So I guess somewhere middle of March, I'll get back to you. Early March, I'll get back to you with over the next one. Well, hope you found this useful. If you have suggestions for improvement or for other items, please let us know. Well, we're always trying to make it as useful for you. So any input is welcome. Well, with that being said, hope to see you all back in 6 to 8 weeks from now.